Hi. As an introduction to organizational communication, we'll talk about multiple models for understanding communication, the history of organizational communication as a field, a working definition of OrgComm, the value of a good theory, and the overall layout of the course. People have been reflecting on how we organize together as humans since the time of the pharaohs in Egypt and Confucius in China. The modern study of organizational communication began in the 1940s and 50s. Note, I said organizational communication. People were studying organizations long before the mid-20th century, but the systematic focus on communication as central in organizing is more recent. In 1967, Phil Tompkins presented the first review of organizational studies, including over 100 works of empirical research on organizing and communication. His review identified two primary topics that had emerged in early research. First, formal and informal channels of communication, and second, superior-subordinate communication. In 1972, Charles Reading, the man widely regarded as the founder of the field of organizational communication, presented a more encompassing summary. In a massive 538-page book, Reading offered 10 postulates that reframed the past and shaped future research. Let's talk more about those postulates. Reading's summative postulates were: meaning is in the interpretive process, not the transmission. In organizations, anything is a potential message. Inputs, specifically listening, are crucially important. The message received is what the receiver will act upon. This is also referred to as selective reception. Feedback is very important in organizations. There is a cost factor to communication. Reading framed it in terms of efficiency equals effectiveness divided by cost. Ultimately, more communication does not equal more effectiveness. The social need for redundancy must be balanced by the economic need for efficiency. Communication overload is important. Messages may not be properly received if too many messages or noise is interfering with the reception of messages. There exists a serial transmission effect. This postulate refers to the fact that the meaning of a message can change when information is traveling through various people. Like the game of telephone we played as children, when one person whispers a message to a friend and whispers the message that they heard to another friend down the line. The humor in the game comes from the fact that the message at the end is often garbled and distorted. Fidelity of reception, where there is shared meaning understood between the participants, is the important part. The organization's climate for communication is more important than communication skills and techniques in and of themselves. Later, Reading went on to suggest that the field of organizational communication emerged for the following reasons. 1. Other social scientists abdicated responsibility by regarding communication merely as a symptom of deeper conditions. 2. The speech field was well prepared to fill this void, especially with regard to rhetorical theory. And 3. Key people in the area provided leadership in research, consulting, and conferences. Ultimately, Reading's work marked a shift from a transmission orientation to a reception orientation in the field of organizational communication. What does that mean? How we think about communication has consequences for how we behave and communicate with others. Historically, organizational scholars have viewed communication as the simple transfer of meaning from one person, say a boss, to another, a subordinate. These linear approaches to communication, such as the transmission and the reception models, which added attention to listening and feedback, they tended to reflect communication as a conduit or a pipeline. This conceptualization may be problematic in that it allows us to think that communication is very easy and can be effective simply by making sure we are clear when we send a message. Clear messages are important, but not sufficient to guarantee good communication in organizations. In reality, other factors such as noise, supportiveness, trust, confidence, credibility, and participation can all impact message understanding and fidelity. In the end, our conceptualizations of communication have moved far beyond linear transmission and reception-based models. Current understandings of communication assume that meaning is produced and reproduced by participants jointly sharing in the communication process. In other words, meaning is constructed or invented through the social process of communication. I generally refer to these understandings of communication as shared meaning models. Let me give you an example to demonstrate the importance of the shared meaning approach to communication. Have you heard the old story of the Pope and the Rabbi? It demonstrates the limitations of linear models of communication that focus solely on the transmission of meaning. All right, so here's the story. Several centuries ago, the Pope decreed that all Jews had to either convert or leave Italy. And this created a huge uproar amongst the Jewish community. And finally, it was decided that there would be a debate, a great debate, and that if the Jews could convince the Pope to stay, they could stay, and otherwise, if they could not convince the Pope, they had to leave. The debate, it was decided, had to be a silent debate because, well, the Pope only spoke Latin, and the rabbi spoke Yiddish. So on the day of the debate, they sat in silence for a full minute before the Pope held up 3 fingers, at which point the rabbi responded by holding up 1 finger. The Pope drew a circle around his head and waited. The rabbi pointed straight to the ground. More silence. The Pope walked over to a table and grabbed a communion wafer and a chalice of wine, at which point the rabbi reached into his pocket and pulled out an apple. "My, you're clever," is what the Pope said. And he said, "Of course, you represent an interesting, learned, and clever people. You beat me in the debate, you may stay." Later, the cardinals, they swarmed around the Pope and they said, "What happened?" And the Pope said, "Well, it was an interesting debate. I began by reminding him about the Holy Trinity, at which point he reminded me of the one God in common between our 2 faiths. I told him that God is all around us, at which point he reminded me that God is right here with us. I took out the communion wafer and the chalice of wine to remind him that God absolves us of our sins, at which point he grabbed an apple to remind me of the original sin." Well, so then the rabbi walked back home and people congregated around him and they said, "What happened?" He looked a little bit more perplexed and said, "Well, it began with him telling me we had 3 days to clear out of Italy, at which point I said to him, 'Up yours.' He said we had to clear out of the entire country, and I said we're staying right here." "What happened next?" the crowd said. He looked even more perplexed at this moment, but said, "I'm not sure. He took out his lunch, so I took out mine." We can see from this story that communication is not always about the simple transfer of information. In this case, there was the transfer of a message, but not necessarily the transfer of meaning. So the ways that we understand and conceptualize communication have greatly expanded over the past century. What does that mean for organizational communication? For one thing, it means that we define, understand, and conceptualize communication in many different ways. Keep in mind, research still reflects all of these understandings of communication: linear approaches, transactional approaches, and shared meaning models, among others. Another implication is that our changing notions regarding communication impact what we study in organizations. In other words, what counts as communication. Research in organizational communication, for example, pays attention to symbols, things like logos, artifacts, uniforms, architecture. Structures, rules, standard procedures created through communication practices. Patterns, typical ways of doing things. Discrete messages, memos, ads, tweets, announcements, infographics, memes. Interactions, relationships, narratives, meetings, both as a set of messages and as messages in and of themselves. Networks, both formal and informal. Rituals, myths, as well as broad discourses in society, such as the multitude of ways that organizations express themselves. This list is in no way exhaustive. It does, however, begin to show how many different forms of communication operate within organizational settings. All of these have been studied within the field of organizational communication. Take a moment and see if you can think of examples of each of these forms of organizational communication here at the University of Minnesota. So now you know a bit more about how the field of organizational communication developed and the growing complexity of how we understand and consequently study communication within organizations. But how exactly do we define organizational communication? Not easily. The tricky part of defining organizational communication is that we're dealing with two incredibly complex phenomena: organization and communication. Communication is a central, and some might say defining, feature of organizations. Indeed, the position that I take is that communication constitutes organization. We create our organizations through communication. Simply put, this means that communication is the basic, defining stuff of organizational life. Without communication, organizations would cease to exist. Organizations are not simply physical containers wherein people communicate, but rather organizations exist because people come together to communicate, thereby creating complex systems that we call organizations. Heavy, huh? It's also exciting when you think about it. Throughout this course, we'll discuss theory, research, and practice related to organizational communication. I remember as an undergraduate always dreading courses that were heavy on theory. The longer I study communication and organizing, however, the more I understand the saying that there is nothing as useful as a good theory. Why is that? Why are theories so important? First, they sensitize us to issues that we take for granted and/or rarely discuss. Critical theory, for example, encourages us to slow down and ask the question, who benefits from this system? Whose interests does it serve? Second, theories provide a professional lens for observation. Cultural theories, for example, point our attention to the importance of stories and metaphors and heroes for better understanding how healthy organizational climates develop. Feminist theories point our attention to how gender functions within organizations in ways that advantage and disadvantage both men and women. Finally, theories equip us with more refined and nuanced terminology to understand and communicate within organizations. When we clearly understand the concept of informal communication networks, for example, we can acknowledge and encourage their important role within organizing.